Welcome everyone to this new edition of Welcome Change. Rosanne and I will jump pretty much straight into it because we have so much ground to cover, and I know there's a huge amount of interest around this question on how we can solve homelessness. I want to welcome you all. I know people have registered from the US, from North America, all over, from Latin America, from South Africa. I've seen registrations from Germany, from other parts of Europe. This is a burning and important and just such an exciting issue also to think about solving homelessness in communities. We have, for those of you who are dialing in from Germany, we are having technical problems with the interpretation. Hopefully you already hear German as I speak. If you don't, please hang in there, and we hope to get the problem solved in the background. I want to jump into this right away, Rosanne. I'm Sascha. I'm an Ashoka Fellow. I've worked with cities for many, many years, and starting with this year, I have joined the Ashoka team in Germany, working in Germany and Europe, and with Ashoka teams globally. And I'm very, very, very excited to be here with Rosanne Haggerty. I'm not going to try to introduce everything you've done. I'm just going to say that Rosanne has, for decades, worked hard on tackling homelessness. She's a social entrepreneur. She's an Ashoka Fellow. And what I personally just love about Rosanne, she is an incredibly serious person when it comes to solving homelessness and managing injustices. But she carries this responsibility of now being a beacon of hope in many communities and guiding a movement through an incredible transformation with just amazing kindness, curiosity, and dignity. And so, Rosanne, it's wonderful to have you here. Welcome to Welcome Change.
Thank you, Sascha, and such a treat to reconnect with you. You've been such an inspiration to me in your work. I think we've known each other about a decade now through Ashoka, so it's really wonderful to be in conversation about this issue we all care so much about.
Mm-hmm. So your story started out with serving people experiencing homelessness in a shelter. You realized that shelters weren't necessarily solving the real problems they were struggling with, like finding jobs, like dealing with health or other social or family issues, and that providing shelter alone was really, in many ways, the wrong answer to the wrong problem in the situation. And your response was something surprising. When I first met you in New York City, you said, "Come by my office," and I stood outside the Prince George Hotel, and I wasn't quite sure what I was looking at. It was this beautiful grand hotel, and it turned out to be a housing development. You converted the hotel into a supporting living facility with a lot of integrated services. And but what blew my mind was not just the way you were solving the social problem in many ways, or the infrastructural problem, but the beauty of the place. And I want to start with this question on where, next to your drive to provide social care and a kind of infrastructure, where does this kind of recognition and the value of beauty come from that is present in so much of your work, and certainly in that building at that time?
Well, I don't think it takes much more imagination to design things well and to be sensitive to the opportunities to create dignified living environments than it takes to assemble resources to, accomplish any type of housing. So I guess early on, I realized that some of these buildings and communities that are overlooked, that are frequently thought of as problematic, they're actually they're hidden assets, and that in redeveloping them in ways that shifted their use to meeting contemporary challenges and creating spaces within them that would benefit the wider community and offer those living there, not just people coming from homelessness typically, but in our residential buildings, we would often incorporate affordable housing for local essential workers that everyone feels that they have benefited if there's a restored building in their community that is in thoughtful ways serving multiple needs. So I can't say there's any like great leap of consciousness there, Sascha. It seems as though our work is strongest when it is maybe reflecting that set of values. How can we approach a situation with an abundance mindset, see what's there, see its possibilities, see how many people can benefit, find ways to align many interests and needs. And so the buildings, as you say, that we don't do as much of anymore are very visible sort of beacons of that.
Yeah, but I think the question of beauty here in many ways, and also you've said this, is almost a placeholder for dignity, right? The extra step of providing the dignity that this community in particular is so often not given, almost by design, not given. I keep thinking when I hear you talk about, I studied architecture, as you know, and my school had the motto "Built with truth, design, and beauty," and this idea that truth and beauty is actually an additional quality to just the truth. And I think when we now switch over to Built for Zero, your organization's incredibly successful campaign to effectively end homelessness. I believe 100 cities have signed up to the campaign. 14, and maybe by today it's more, 14 cities have achieved what you call functional zero homelessness. Before we go into this, and everyone here is dying to hear how you're doing this, but before we go into the technicality of how we're ending homelessness, I want to ask you, at what moment did you realize that ending homelessness was possible, that solving homelessness was possible? Because when I first, when you were developing the Prince George and with your prior organization, you were building housing units, large number of those, but suddenly to say we're going to end homelessness sets a different tone. So at what point did you think, oh, it's possible?
Well, Sascha, you began with the reference to my first exposure to homelessness being that time as a full-time volunteer just out of college when I was working at a shelter for homeless young people. And that's what I saw, like, wait a minute, like we have all the right intentions, but we have the wrong aim. We were sheltering young people for 30 days at a time when none of the young people I was interacting with had 30-day problems. To get back on their feet, they needed much more in the way of an investment in housing so they could, or some kind of stability in their lives so they could actually rebuild their lives and get on a path to a stable adulthood. And so it was really from the first moments that I was like, why is the response at this time in New York, it was in the 80s, like a lot of emergency shelters, when there is no off-ramp in the lives of any of the people I'm interacting with? That has to be created. And so this insight that the problem was not so enormous, but the response was so mismatched to what was actually happening was it's sort of that's guided our work ever since. But from the very beginning, it was clear that this is not in its dimensions an overwhelming problem. We're just not being clear-eyed about what's going on here. Like, an emergency shelter is an important resource for community to have for a short-term emergency. It is absolutely the wrong response if you have a structural problem where there is insufficient housing or a broken system around connecting vulnerable people to housing. And that was also sort of present in my first exposure to the issue. where I worked by day with these young people, and 2 nights a week I volunteered at an overnight shelter for homeless women. And it was just really the beginnings of mass homelessness in the United States and other countries. And I tell the story of how and the good people, running the shelter overnight for the ladies would say, yeah, like, here are the cots, here's the coffee pot, here's the time the bus is going to be picking folks up in the morning. But the ladies would arrive and they'd be like, how do I find housing? Where do I apply? And there was no, kind of matching of what people actually needed and the responses we had on hand. And so what is exciting, and fast forward, I've always believed and seen the dimensions of this problem, were the dimensions of it made it solvable. The urgency made it necessary that we find solutions. But fast forward to, I'd say it was maybe 6 years ago now, we were increasingly seeing, once we shifted course and started focusing on these system connection issues, building an operating system with communities to actually solve the right problem, which is preventing and ending homelessness, not helping homeless people survive another day. When we started figuring out what it was going to take to do that comprehensive system building, and we saw communities with comprehensive information on who is experiencing homelessness, measurably reducing that number, and our first communities reaching functional zero, as you described, which is a measure of homelessness being rare overall across a population in a geography, quickly flagged when any new crisis occurs, so it doesn't become this sinking into the abyss situation that happens, and is quickly, 45 days is what communities aim for, resolved in a way that makes that housing solution sustainable. Now, when we saw the first communities achieve that, we're like, we've always known this is possible, and now we understand what the mechanism is, and now we have the kind of growing number of proof points that make this this method, this way of working, actually very relevant and hopeful for any community.
Yeah, when after 30 years abroad, last year I moved back to Germany for the first time. I was from New York. I was really surprised to find that Berlin, where I now live, has the same percentage of homelessness as the average American large city. That is surprising, I think, to a lot of people. But that is also a guess, because we don't really know how many homeless people we have in Berlin. The numbers vary, in orders of magnitude according to who you ask. So the same percentage applies to the lower number, the lower estimate, but we don't know how that works. So now I kind of, I want you to explain to us, how does Build for Zero work? What actually happens in a community? And especially because we also have such a large international audience here, what can we do to do the same, to solve homelessness, to end homelessness in our communities? What can you tell us? How does this work?
Well, this is a set of insights that have been really co-created by, as you mentioned now, more than 100 communities in the United States, and a growing number of parallel efforts in other countries. And essentially, what it takes to solve a complex problem, holding homelessness aside, it's a particular type of problem. And I think it's the type of problem that confounds us in our communities now, that it doesn't live in one place. It requires, we have seen in homelessness 5 things, but we suspect this is relevant to many other complex problems of, health equity, of employment access, climate. You need a shared aim. Everybody working on the problem, everyone who's touching the problem needs to be working toward the same result, which has to be clearly stated and measured, and progress has to be measured in the same way. We have to evolve past the world of random worthy efforts on these issues that are so life-threatening. So we start with helping communities gather the critical players. In the United States, it's about 5 different, like the not-for-profit, city and county government, the government, the quasi-governmental housing agency, our Veterans Affairs, local offices. Get those folks who all have a piece of the resource, the information, the mandate, get them all to be solving the same problem and help them really commit to shared accountability toward that measurable shared aim. There's a whole evolution of work that has to happen that our team helps to coach that local body through, which is to work as a nimble team, not my program versus your program, and here's what we do, and no, this is the line we draw. That also has to change. And it's funny, Sascha, we know that. Like everybody who has worked in this field, any field where you need to collaborate, just like, oh, we're all in our silos. Well, Built for Zero, I'd say, like, it's kind of a way to get past the silo. So you need to learn and function as an integrated team to deliver that shared aim. Key to making this all work and is forming a shared picture of what's actually happening on the ground with this issue. And so it took years to figure out how to do this, but critical to any community's progress on this, or I'd say other complex problems, is knowing who is affected by the problem across the population, having comprehensive, accurate, real time, and we define that as at least real time to a month, but most communities now can update their data weekly, and shared with appropriate privacy protections, information on what is the problem you're trying to solve. Homelessness, like so many other problems, it's a dynamic problem. It's going to look different in one community versus another. It's going to look different today than it did yesterday as people experience housing crises, move in and out of them. And so having that shared truth of a common picture of reality that shows how the issue is moving and changing across a population is something that we help communities to do, to create, to combine all of their data into what might be considered like a very reliable public health registry. This is a language we all know after COVID, like the data changes from day to day. You have to be solving today's problem, not what was true 2 months ago. And then increasingly, helping communities to apply their resources in the most flexible ways to intervene where their data shows the highest effect will take place for a population level shift. So we can be fascinated with evidence-based programs, but it could be that that's not what you need at this particular moment to actually drive reductions across a population. So you'd need to be looking at your data and having this combined team say, all right, it looks like we've got an issue now this week of people who we've assisted in the past returning to homelessness. What's going on? We need to really test some new interventions to shift that. And then part of that is we train community teams to use data data analytics as a problem-solving practice. Too often in the not-for-profit world, our experience with data is we need it for reports. We fear that a funder will use it for judgment, but in fact, it's such a powerful and necessary learning tool. And so having this data feedback loop about what's working, what's changing, is coupled in our coaching with helping teams apply quality improvement to learn how to iterate in a structured way, to not take ideological positions, it's this or it's that. It's just like, let's form a hypothesis, test it in a rapid cycle, and see how if it's working and how we move from there. And then lastly, what we've done with Built for Zero is we have created this very robust network of all the participating communities so that no one is having to innovate alone, and no one is out on this road to actually shift the way their communities work without knowing that there's a community behind them that is sharing their learning, celebrating their success. And so that the network and what you can draw from, at this point, a very deep testable menu of strategies that other communities have applied is that final piece. So the shared aim, the integrated nimble team, the data, the flexible resources, and the benefits of the network for learning and acceleration of progress. Those are the elements that make Built for Zero work.
This is quite something, because it's such a kind of powerful illustration of how you can align people around a really groundbreaking idea, right? Most people have thought about homelessness as this endless problem, and you've shown that it's finite. It's actually, there is an end to it if you work yourself through the caseload, and that is done not by clustering the cases into kind of mass solutions, but actually tackling them one by one, right? Your by name weekly data really is like, okay, let's solve for these people. What do they need? How do we do this? And put aside all the other differences. I think it also highlights another important point, which is the existing infrastructure is not necessarily ideal, but it's not really a matter of how good or bad our bureaucracy is, how good or bad our infrastructure is. It's really a matter of whether the right people in the room accept a certain way of working together. I want to roll a question that came from Anne Evans, my colleague in here, and with one of my own questions. She asked about that many faith communities are engaged with this problem, and how much have you found their perspectives helpful or not, and you know, what words of encouragement or challenge you might offer them. And I want to add to that whenever I talk to you, I'm really amazed that you don't pin the blame on a mayor or a particular local official, but you're saying the whole community is responsible for solving this problem, and that the whole community has to embrace and believe in this idea. And I keep thinking about this because it signals something really important, that by taking ownership of ending homelessness, we're also beginning to accept that social injustices can be solved, right? It's one of those, you know, if you accept the endless problem, then it's just a fact of life. They're homeless people, and that's just how it is. And once you accept that you're solving it, it tells us something about the kind of community we want to live in. So I want to see if I'll throw these two kind of questions packaged into one to you to see if you can make some beautiful sense of it. But I think they're interconnected.
I agree. And let me also just highlight that you don't solve homelessness once. You don't get to functional zero and then celebrate. You know, you basically, you know, solving homelessness means learning how to solve it every day and locking in that commitment and the new behaviors. And as the issue, you know, may shift over time, there's a fire at a large building, there's a natural disaster, you know, you have to dial up what you're doing, you know, and just so what's also comforting, I think, about this definition not only being attainable, but that it's real, is that it is designed to essentially, you know, evolve based on that commitment to always be at zero and to do whatever it takes to hold that, to get back to that, and that it's not a one-time event. And so I feel as though this is, you know, kind of a signal of the direction of our social problem solving, a mature understanding of there is no silver bullet. There's commitments, there's accountability, there's behaviors in service of a common aim. And I think your point about the faith community and who's responsible, absolutely linked. You know, the faith community, especially in the United States, which is what I can mainly speak to, is it was the first responders, you know, to modern homelessness. And, you know, that agency I worked with, it was a Catholic agency that was volunteering in the basement of a church for, you know, helping those women, sadly, like with coffee, not with housing solutions. But the faith community we see in Built for Zero communities is, I think, is so primed to play a new role, which is around prevention and diversion of people who are at the cusp of losing their homes. I think that's when, you know, like neighbors and more informal resources can play a very significant role. We also, in, you know, across, you know, our many communities now, I don't think there's a single community where a religious-based organization with its many volunteers isn't a critical part of that local team. And I think that the faith community, broadly, has an important role to play that we're actually, doing a lot of thinking about in terms of our communications. Because I think, Sascha, one of the greatest barriers that communities face is the sense of the inevitability of the problem, that the disbelief that this can be solved. And I think people of faith are in this situation to speak up for another truth, that like, actually, it's not just a good thing that we do this. It's not just morally right. There is actually a solution. It requires a sort of, frankly, a giving up of ego, of like my own program, my own shelter, this, to like, what do we need to do together to get to the other side of this problem? And so I think we see, gosh, I'm places like Fremont, Colorado, last year ended veteran homelessness. And it was an effort led by their faith community. And Abilene, Texas, has ended chronic and veteran homelessness. And it's really their faith community that has been the mobilizer of like different local resources. And so we have lots of evidence of what can happen when the local faith community really catches fire on, like, we can be working toward justice and beyond charity. And there's also a role, that they're modeling, but that it needs to be played by every other entity. You mentioned mayors, and mayors are easy targets. It's like, why is this problem getting worse? And I think the challenge for mayors is that most of them don't have alone the insight, the tools to actually make the kind of progress that's necessary. And so you just end up in this very destructive, costly for everyone kind of circular process of, people angry about rising homelessness, mayors making very short-term policy, like, let's clear this encampment, let's throw a little bit of money at this or that. And then inevitably it doesn't work. People get more frustrated. They fall into reinforcing this idea that it's not a solvable problem. And so getting out of this bind is really quite critical, which is why this shared accountability across different organizations is so powerful. And I'll just repeat again, and at least in the United States, it's the key geography is that we work with is often a county, which is a region more than just a city alone. But the mayor of the large city, the leadership of that county government, the prominent not-for-profits who are receiving the significant federal resources for responding to homelessness, the government housing agency, and the Department of Veterans Affairs. Those are the folks who all have a critical role to play. The mayor can't do it alone. The not-for-profits can't do it alone. The housing agency can't do it alone. But I think the genius of figuring a way to get everybody in the same room is probably relevant everywhere, which is actually that group can make progress. So just to underscore, we don't want to let mayors off the hook, but we also don't want to suggest that they alone can do it. So it really has to be this team approach.
One question, probably the elephant in the room for many people, is came in from one of the members of the one listener or viewer, is how do you find enough housing? I don't even need to read the rest of the question. I think that's just sums it up.
Well, we have a housing crisis almost everywhere, but here are a couple of things that just are realities that we have to grapple with. One, communities, for the most part, in Built for Zero communities, the majority now have this by-name real-time quality data, but most communities have no idea of the dimensions of the problems they're trying to solve. So it's totally flying blind to like, oh, we need X amount of housing units, we'll never get there, so like, why even try? Most communities have no idea the dimensions and the nature of the problem they're trying to solve. So they can't even identify what part of the problem is housing supply or of what type. In the United States alone, there are many different profiles of communities. There are communities, coastal communities that are very high cost, other communities that have lost population where housing cost or availability isn't the problem. There are other places where there's just a misalignment of rents are just above what is attainable with a minimum wage job. So market conditions vary, and so you need to have good data to really understand what part of the problem is supply, and then what type of supply you need. We have really seen in terms of the programs in the United States that support most affordable housing development, a great deal of rigidity, even in terms of the assumptions of how people wish to live, or the range of housing options people wish to have in terms of shared units, the ability to access housing for more limited periods as people are getting back on their feet, housing with different types of support amenities. All of these things are relevant to getting to a place where a community is not seeing homelessness as something that's growing and as a symbol of a failed housing system. So anyway, we keep coming back to start with the data, but then most communities do have a housing supply problem. But this is where I think we also have a job to do in sort of reframing, like, what is homelessness? It's not a standalone problem. It's actually a symptom of the problem of broken housing systems. And we see a very powerful direction that becomes a bit more imaginable for communities to adopt when you suggest that, this data on people experiencing homelessness suggests that all of the housing policies in a community should actually be moving toward a shared aim. Like no homelessness, no one paying more than 30% of their income in rent, no one living in substandard housing, and equitable access. If all of our policies, were about getting that collective result, I think you'd see, just an enormous shift in the outcomes communities achieve for the housing dollars and the housing policies they advance. It's a bit of an indirect answer, but we are so accustomed to communities saying, we don't have enough housing, nothing to be done. And we say, we now have the evidence in more than 100 places that you don't even know what housing you need and what barriers you've created inadvertently with your local policies or until you do the work of understanding the dynamics of homelessness and getting better data on the nature of the problem, and then holding yourself accountable as a community to having your policies address those vital collective goals. It's not enough to say, well, we'll do one housing project and call it a day, and it's their problem, those people experiencing homelessness, that they didn't get in. And that's too much what we see if you start with, we just need more housing.
I mean, it's extraordinary when listening to you. You're on the one hand incredibly systematic about breaking down the problem and tackling so many of our preconceptions. So when I looked at, just in my own city in Berlin, when I looked at how many people are homeless, that's not a huge number. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, most people who think that we need to build hundreds of thousands of units of more housing to solve the problem, they seem to think that what we have on the streets now is like the permanent, so to speak, flood level, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas actually what you're showing is that once you work through that caseload, mm-hmm. you find that you have to solve one case at a time. You're not, it doesn't, replenish itself to always the same level, which comes back to this idea that this is a bottomless problem. Yeah. The other thing was that we had a huge influx of refugees from Ukraine mm-hmm. in the city, and people have successfully accommodated 10 times more people than they're homeless in the city. And you could really see this mm-hmm. effect of people stepping up, and they didn't just accommodate them by sharing their apartments, which a lot of people do, but they also created much more efficient connections in the market that has very little visibility. So I think we'll have to end this soon. I want to end on a question that came in here, which is which is it's kind of a data question, but I'm interested anyhow in the kind of what correlations do you find between communities solving homelessness and being able to solve other kinds of health or social or climate change related problems? So is this having like spillover effects, or does this kind of solving this problem unlock the ability to tackle other major challenges in communities?
Well, it's a great question, and one that keenly interests us because we believe that this will be true. I don't think we have sufficient evidence to point to it, but what we are hearing from so many of our communities is that, what's powerful about being part of this Built for Zero movement is that the skills that their government and not-for-profit, blended teams are learning are just the kinds of skills they need to face into 21st century problems that require a new way of thinking, a new way of working, a new, frankly, a new way of contracting, a new way of just understanding how to tame complex problems. Most people have been trained to work on technical problems, and that's insufficient in the world we live in now. And so we've seen a little hint of that, Sascha, during COVID, that teams that were already, together and working, they were able to get people, like once new resources became available, like an unbelievable, with unbelievable speed into hotels, into apartments, like the additional infusion of resources just made their ability to kind of gather in a new emergency context and be effective. Like that was a really powerful test of this idea, but it's still within the homelessness space. And so what we are really eager to, and we're looking for signals of like, where is this moving into how the community is tackling health equity issues? But we see it on the horizon.
Yeah, no, I want to give justice because we have so many more questions coming in, and I'm just going to run over a few minutes, Rosanne, if you allow me.
Sure.
So one question, and there is one in German as well as in English from Angela Coleman, an Ashoka Fellow, who wants to know how she can become part of your homelessness prevention network with her community in Baltimore. And Jörg Richard in Germany, who's asking, who is taking the lead in this process? Is it the political parties? Is it individuals, city council members, the mayors, the organizers? Who's setting this in motion? And maybe there is a relationship between these two questions as to how to get the ball started and how to work with your organization.
Sure. Well, Angela, we'd love your help. Baltimore is part of Built for Zero, and I know you can find me through Ashoka, but I'm at rhaggerty@community.solutions. And then the larger question about how to get started, it really needs to be ideally two of those groups that I mentioned, Sascha, like the coalition of not-for-profits, the mayor, the housing agency, the county, the VA. We can get started with one. Like if the mayor's office, asks like, how do I get my community involved? We will go and try to get those other, at least, one or two others right at the outset, excited about the idea, ready to commit to that collaborative work. But it goes a lot faster if some of that work has happened ahead of time, that like the housing agency and the VA and the coalition of not-for-profits are just like, we know, we have seen the problem and it's us. Like we need to, rethink the way we work. And so it's joining Built for Zero is triggered by that kind of outreach, but it has to be someone with sufficient kind of leadership in one of these key lanes to kind of credibly bring others to the table to make a shared commitment.
Rosanne, I want to thank you so much for sharing with us today and for taking part in this Welcome Change session. It's been so rewarding. Our colleagues here have shared the links to Build for Zero. Rosanne has shared her email address with you, so you can reach out to her, and I'm happy to help anyone from Germany who's interested in learning more, answering specific questions and liaising here. Rosanne, it's such a privilege to have this time with you, and thank you for joining us.
Sascha, thank you. Amazing. And before we go, I want very much to just appreciate the time you've spent learning about our organization. And I know your book, The Slow Lane, will be coming out within the year, but you really, your thoughtfulness and understanding how things work and that they take time, we so appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Rosanne. So I want to thank everyone who's been here with us today and close this meeting. And please join the next Welcome Change meeting that is happening, I believe, next week, if I saw the chat correctly. Thank you.